Preamble. Article 1. Name and territory of the Union. Article 2. Admission or establishment of new state. Article 2A. Sikkim to be associated with Union. Article 3. Formation of new state and alteration of areas, boundaries or names of existing state. Article 4. Law made under Article 2 or 3 to provide for amendment of the first and fourth schedule, supplement incidental and consequential. Part 2. Citizenship. Article 5. Citizenship at the commencement of Constitution. Article 6. Right of citizenship of certain persons who have migrated to India from Pakistan. Article 7. Right of citizenship of certain migrant to Pakistan. Article 8. Right of citizenship of certain person of Indian origin residing outside India. Article 9. Person voluntarily acquiring citizenship of a foreign state not to be a citizen. Article 10. Continuation of the right of citizenship. Article 11. Parliament to regulate the right of citizenship of law. Part 3. Fundamental rights. Article 12. Definition. Article 13. Law inconsistent with or in derogation of the fundamental right. Article 14. Equality before law. Article 15. Prohibition of discrimination on ground of religion, race, caste or sex or place of birth. Article 16. Equality of opportunity in matter of public employment. Article 17. Abolition of untouchability. Article 18. Abolition of title. Article 19. Protection of certain rights regarding freedom of speech. Article 20. Protection in respect of conviction for offences. Article 21. Protection of life and personal liberty. Article 21A. Right to education. Article 22. Protection against arrest and detention in certain cases. Article 23. Prohibition of traffic in human being and forced labour. Article 24. Provision of employment of children in factories etc. Article 25. Freedom of conscience and free profession, practice and propagation of religion. Article 26. Freedom to manage religious affairs. Article 27. Freedom as to payment of taxes for promotion of any particular region. Article 28. Freedom as to attendance at religious instruction or religious worship in certain education institution. Article 29. Protection of interest of minority. Article 30. Right of minority to establish and administer educational institution. Article 31. Compulsory acquisition of property. Article 31A. Saving of law providing for acquisition of estate. Article 31B. Validation of certain act and regulation. Article 31C. Saving of law giving effect to certain directive principle. Article 31D. Saving of law in respect of anti-national activity. Article 32. Remedies for enforcement of right conferred by this part. Article 32A. Constitution validity of state law not to be considered in proceeding under Article 32. Article 33. Power of Parliament to modify the right conferred by this part in their application to forces. Article 34. Restriction on the right conferred by this part while martial law is in force in any area. Article 35. Legislation to give effect to the provision of this part. Article 35A. Saving of law with respect to permanent residents and their right. Part 4. Directive principle of state policy. Article 36. Definition. Article 37. Application of the principle contained. Application in the principle contained in this part. Article 38. State to secure a social order for the promotion of welfare of the people. Article 39. Certain principle of policy to be followed by the state. Article 39A. Equal justice and free legal aid. Article 14. Organization of village panchayat. Article 41. Right to work, to education and to public assistance in certain cases. Article 42. Provision of just and human condition of work and maternity relief. Article 43. Living wages etc. for worker. Article 43A. participation of worker in management of industry. Article 43B, promotion of cooperative society. Article 44, uniform civil code for the citizen. Article 45, provision for earlier childhood care and education to children below the age of 6 years. Article 46, promotion of educational and economic interest of scheduled caste, scheduled tribe and weaker section. Article 47, duty of the state to raise the level of nutrition and the standard of living and to improve public health. Article 48, organization of agriculture and animal husbandry. Article 48A, protection and improvement of environment and safeguarding of forest and wildlife. Article 49, protection of monuments and places, an object of national importance. Article 50, separation of judiciary from executive. Article 51, promotion of international peace and security. Part 4A, fundamental duties. Part 5, the Union. Article 52, President of India. Article 53, executive power of the Union. Article 54, election of President. Article 55, manner of election of President. Article 56, term of office of President. Article 57, eligibility for re-election. Article 58, qualification for election as President. Article 59, condition of President's office. Article 60, oath or affirmation by the President. Article 61, procedure for impeachment of the President. Article 62, time of holding election to fill vacancy in the office of President and the term of office of person effected to fill casual vacancy. Article 63, Vice President of India. Article 64, Vice President to be ex officio Chairman of the Council of State. Article 65, the Vice President to act as President or to discharge his function during casual vacancy in the office or during absence of President. Article 66, election of Vice President. Article 67, term of office of Vice President. Article 68, time of holding election to fill vacancy in the office of Vice President and the term of office of person elected to fill casual vacancy. Article 69, oath or affirmation by the Vice President. Article 70, discharge of President function in other contingency. Article 71, matter relating to or connected with the election of a President or Vice President. Article 72, power of President to grant pardon etc. and to suspend, remit or commute sentence in certain cases. Article 73, extent of executive power of the Union. Article 74, Council of Ministers to aid and advise President. Article 75, other provision as to Minister. Article 76, Attorney General for India. Article 77, conduct of business of the Government of India. Article 78, duty of Prime Minister as respect the furnishing the information to the President. Article 79, Constitution of Parliament. Article 80, composition of Council of State. Article 81, composition of the House of the People. Article 82, readjustment after each session. Article 83, duration of House of Parliament. Article 84, qualification for membership of Parliament. Article 85, sessions of Parliament, progression and dissolution. Article 86, right of President to address and send message to Houses. Article 87, special address by the President. Article 88, right of Minister and Attorney General as respect Houses. Article 89, the Chairman and Deputy Chairman of the Council of State. Article 90, vacation and resignation of and removal from the office of Deputy Chairman. Article 91, power of Deputy Chairman or other person to perform the duties of the office or to act as Chairman. Article 90, 92, the Chairman or the Deputy Chairman not to preside while a resolution for his removal from office is under consideration. Article 93, the Speaker and Deputy Speaker of the House of the People. Article 94, vacation and resignation of and removal from the office of Speaker and Deputy Speaker. Article 95, power of Deputy Speaker to other person to perform the duties of the office of or to act as Speaker. Article 96, the Speaker or the Deputy Speaker not to preside while a resolution for his removal from office is under consideration. 97, salaries and allowance of the Chairman and Deputy Chairman and the Speaker and the Deputy Speaker. Article 98, Secretariat of Parliament. Article 99, oath or affirmation by member. 100, voting in House and power of Houses to act notwithstanding vacancies and quorum. Article 101, vacation of seat. Article 102, disqualification for membership. Article 103 decision on question as to disqualification of member. Article 104 penalty for sitting and voting before making oath or affirmation under Article 99 or when not qualified or when disqualified. Article 105 power, privilege, etc. of the House of Parliament and of the member and committee thereof. Article 106 salary and allowance of member. Article 107 provision as to introduction and passing of bill. Article 108 joint sitting of both houses in certain cases. Article 109 special procedure in respect of money bill. Article 1010 110 definition of money bill. Article 111 assent to bill. Article 112 annual financial statement. Article 113 procedure in parliament with respect to estimate. Article 114 appropriation bill. Article 115 supplementary, additional or excess grant. Article 116 vote on account, vote of credit and exceptional grant. Article 117 special provision as to financial bill. Article 118 rules of procedure. Article 119 regulation by law of procedure in parliament in relation to financial business. Article 120 language to be used in parliament. Article 121 restriction on discussion in parliament. Article 122 court not to require into proceeding of parliament. Article 123 power of president to promulgate ordinance during recess of parliament. Article 124 establishment and constitution of Supreme Court. Article 124 National Judicial Appointment Commission. Article 124b function of commission. Article 124c power of parliament to make law. Article 125 salaries etc. of judges. Article 126 appointment of acting chief justice. Article 127 appointment of ad hoc judges. Article 128 attendance of retired judges at sitting of the Supreme Court. Article 129 Supreme Court to be record court of record. Article 130 seat of Supreme Court. Article 131 original jurisdiction of Supreme Court. Article 131a executive jurisdiction of the Supreme Court in regard to question as to constitutional validity of central law. Article 132 appellate jurisdiction of Supreme Court in appeal from High Court in certain cases. Article 133 appellate jurisdiction of Supreme Court in appeal from High Court in regard to civil matter. Article 134 appellate jurisdiction of Supreme Court in regard to criminal matter. Article 134a certificate for appeal to the Supreme Court. Article 135 jurisdiction and power of the federal court under existing law to be exercisable by the Supreme Court. Article 136 special leave to appeal by the Supreme Court. Article 137 review of judgment or order by the Supreme Court. Article 138 enlargement of the jurisdiction of the Supreme Court. Article 139 conferment on the Supreme Court of power to issue certain writ. Article 139a transfer of certain cases. Article 140 ancillary power of Supreme Court. Article 141 law declared by the Supreme Court to be binding on all court. Article 142 enforcement of decree and order of Supreme Court and order as to discovery etc. Article 143 power of President to consult Supreme Court. Article 144 civil and judicial authorities to act in and of the Supreme Court. Article 144a special provision as to disposal of question relating to constitutional validity of laws. Article 145 rules of court etc. Article 146 officer and servant and the expenses of Supreme Court. Article 147 interpretation. Article 148 comptroller or Auditor General of India. Article 149 duties and power of the comptroller and Auditor General. Article 115 form of account of the Union and of the state. Article 151 audit report. Part 6 the state. Article 152 definition. Article 153 governor of a state. Article 154 executive power of state. Article 155 Appointment of Governor. Article 156 Term of Office of Governor. Article 157 Qualification to Appointment as Governor. Article 158 Condition of Governor Office. Article 159 Oath or Affirmation by the Governor. Article 160 Discharge of the function of the Governor in certain contingency. Article 161 Power of Governor to grant pardon etc. and to suspend, remit and commute sentences in certain cases. Article 162 Extent of executive power of state. Article 163 Council of Minister to aid and advise Governor. Article 164 Other provision as to Minister. Article 165 Advocate General for the state. Article 166 Conduct of business of the Governor of a state. Article 167 Duties of Chief Minister as respect the furnishing of information to Governor etc. Article 168 Constitution of Legislature in state. Article 169 Evolution or creation of legislative council in state. Article 170 Composition of the Legislative Assembly. Article 171 Composition of the Legislative Council. Article 172 Duration of state legislature. Article 173 Qualification for membership of the state legislature. Article 174 Session of state legislature, progression and dissolution. Article 175 Right of Governor to address and send message to the House of or Houses. Article 176 Special address by the Governor. Article 177 Right of Minister and Advocate as respect to the Houses. Article 178 The Speaker and Deputy Speaker of Legislative Assembly. Article 179 Vacation and resignation of and removal from the office of Speaker and Deputy Speaker. Article 180 Power of Deputy Speaker or other person to perform duties of the office of or to act as Speaker. Article 181 Speaker or the Deputy Speaker not to preside while a resolution for his removal from office is under consideration. Article 182 Chairman and Deputy Chairman of Legislative Council. Article 183 Vacation and resignation of removed from the office of Chairman and Deputy Chairman. Article 184 Power of Deputy Chairman or other person to perform the duties of the office of or to act as Chairman. Article 185 The Chairman or the Deputy Chairman not to reside while a resolution for his removal from office is under consideration. Article 186 Salaries and allowance of the Speaker and Deputy Speaker and Chairman and the Deputy Chairman. Article 187 Secretariat of State Legislature. Article 188 Oath or affirmation by member. Article 189 Voting in houses, power of houses to act notwithstanding vacancies and quorum. Article 190 Vacation of seat. Article 191 Disqualification for membership. Article 192 Decision on question as to disqualification of member. Article 193 Penalty for sitting and voting before making oath or affirmation under Article 188 or when not qualified or when disqualified. Article 194 Power and privilege etc. of the House of Legislature and of the member and committing thereof. Article 195 Salaries and allowance of member. Article 196 Provision as to introduction and passing of bill. Article 197 Restriction on power of Legislative Council as to bill other than money bill. Article 198 Special procedure in respect of money bill. Article 199 Definition of money bill. Article 200 Assents to bill. Article 201 Bill reserved for consideration. Article 202 Annual financial statement. Article 203 Procedure in legislature with respect to estimate. Article 204 Appropriation bill. Article 205 Supplementary, additional or excess grant. Article 206 Vote on account, vote of credit and exceptional grant. Article 207 Special provision as to financial bill. Article 208 Rules of procedure. Article 209 Regulation of procedure in the legislature of the state in relation to financial business. Article 210 Language to be used in the legislature. Article 211 Restriction on discussion in the legislature. Article 212 Court not to inquire into the proceeding of legislature. Article 213 Power of governor to promulgate ordinance during recess of legislature. Article 214 High Court for state. Article 215 High Court to be court of record. Article 216 Constitution of High Court. Article 217 Appointment and Condition of the Office of a Judge of High Court. Article 218 Application of certain provision relating to Supreme Court to High Court. Article 219 Oath or Affirmation by Judge of High Court. Article 220 Restriction on Practice after being a permanent judge. Article 221 Salaries etc. of Judge. Article 222 Transfer of a judge from one High Court to another. Article 223 Appointment of Acting Chief Justice. Article 224 Appointment of Additional and Acting Judges. Article 224A Appointment of Retired Judges at Sitting of High Court. Article 225 Jurisdiction of Existing High Court. Article 226 Power of High Court to issue certain writ. Article 226 A Constitutional validity of central law not to be considered in proceeding under Article 226. Article 227 Power of superintendence over all court by the High Court. Article 228 Transfer of certain cases to High Court. Article 228 A Special provision as to disposal of question relating to constitutional validity of state law. Article 229 Officers and servant and expenses of High Court. Article 213 Extension of jurisdiction of High Court to Union territories. Article 223 Establishment of a common High Court for two or more states. Article 232 omitted. Article 233 Appointment of District Judge. Article 233A Validation of appointment of and judgment etc. delivered by District Judge. Article 234 Recruitment of person other than District Judge to the judicial services. Article 235 Control over subordinate court. Article 236 Interpretation. Article 237 Application of the provision of this chapter to certain class or class of magistrate. Part 7 The state in Part B in first schedule. Part 8 The Union territories. Article 239 Administration of Union Territory. Article 239A Creation of local legislature or council of minister or both for certain union territories. Article 233A Special provision with respect to death. Article 239B Provision in cases of failure of constitutional machinery. Article 239B Power of Administrator to promulgate ordinance during recess of legislature. Article 214 Power of President to make regulation for certain union territories. Article 241 High Court for Union Territory. Article 242 Part 9 Panchayat. Article 243 Definition. Article 243 Gram Panchayat. 243B Constitution of Panchayat. 243 The Composition of Panchayat. 243 Reservation of Panchayat. Duration of Panchayat. Article Part 9 Municipalities. Article 224 Part 10 Administration of Scheduled Area and Tribal Cases. Article 240 Formation of an autonomous state comprising certain tribal areas in Assam and creation of division. Part 11 Relation between Union and State. Article 245 Extent of law made by the Parliament and by the legislature of state. Article 246 Subject matter of law made by Parliament and by the legislature of state. Article 246 A special provision with respect to good and service taxes. Article 247 Power of Parliament to provide establishment of certain additional court. Article 248 Residuary power of legislation. Article 249 Power of Parliament to legislate with respect to a matter in the state less in the national interest. Article 250 Power of Parliament to legislate with respect to any matter in the state list if a proclamation of emergency is in operation. Article 251 in consisting between laws made by Parliament under Article 249 and laws made by the legislature of state. Article 252 Power of Parliament to legislate for two or more states by consent and adoption of such legislation by any state. Article 253 Legislation for giving effect to international agreement. Article 254 in consisting between law made by the Parliament and law made by the legislature of state. Article 255 Requirement as to a recommendation and previous section to be regarded as matter of procedure only. Article 256 Obligation of state and the union. Article 257 Control of the union over state in certain cases. Article 257A Assistance to state by deployment of armed forces or other forces of the union. Article 258 Power of the union to confirm power etc on state in certain cases. Article 258 A Power of state to entrust function to the union. Article 259 Armed forces in state in Part B of the first schedule. Article 260 Jurisdiction of the union in relation to territories outside India. Article 261 Public Act Record and Judicial Proceeding. Article 262 Adjudication of dispute relating to water, interstate river or river valley. Article 263 Provision with respect to an interstate council. Part 12 Finance, Property, Contract and Suit. Article 264 Interpretation. Article 265 Taxes not to be imposed save by authority of law. Article 263 Consolidated Fund and Public Account of India of the State. Article 267 Contingency Fund. Article 268 Duty levied by the Union but collected and appropriated by the State. Article 268A Service Tax levied by Union and collected and appropriated by the Union and the State. Article 269 Taxes levied and collected by the Union but assigned to the State. Article 269A Levy and collection of goods and services in course of interstate trade or commerce. Article 270 Law levied and distributed between the Union and the State. Article 271 Surcharge on certain duties and taxes for purpose of the Union. Article 272 Taxes which are levied and collected by the Union and may be disturbed between the Union and the State. Article 273 Grant in lieu of export duty on jute and jute product. Article 274 Prior recommendation of President required to bill affecting taxes in which state are interested. Article 275 Grant from the Union to certain state. Article 276 Tax on professional trades and calling and employment. Article 277 Saving. Article 278 Agreement with state in Part B of the first schedule with regard to certain financial matter. Article 279 Calculation of net proceed. Article 279 A Goods and Service Tax Council. Article 280 Finance Commission. Article 281 Recommendation of the Finance Commission. Article 282 Expenditure deferable by the Union or a state out of its revenue. Article 283 Custody etc. of consolidated fund, contingency fund and money credited to the public account. Article 284 Custody of suitor deposit and other money reserved by public servant and court. Article 285 Exemption of property of the Union from state taxation. Article 286 Restriction as to imposition of tax on the state or purchase or good. Article 287 Exemption from taxes on electricity. Article 288 Exception from taxation by state in respect of water or electricity in certain cases. Article 289 Exception of property and income of a state from union taxation. Article 290 Adjustment in respect of certain exceptions and pension. Article 290A Annual payment to certain Devasan fund. Article 291 Privy per sum of ruler. Article 292 Borrowing by the Government of India. Article 293 Borrowing by state. Article 294 Succession to property, assets, right, liabilities and obligation in certain cases. Article 295 Succession to property, assets, right and liabilities and obligation in other cases. Section 296 Property accruing by cheat or lapse or as bona vacancy. Article 296 Things of value within territorial water, continental shelf and resource of the exclusive economic zone to west in the Union. Article 298 Power to carry on trade etc. Article 299 Contract. Article 300 Suit and proceeding. Article 300A Person not to be deprived of property save by authority of law. Part 13 Trade, commerce and intercourse within territory of India. Freedom of trade, commerce and intercourse 301. 302 power of parliament to impose restriction on trade, commerce and intercourse. 303 restriction on the legislative power of the union and the state with regard to trade and commerce. 304 restriction on trade, commerce and intercourse among states. Article 305 saving of existing law and law providing for state monopolies. Article 306 power of certain state in Part B of the first schedule to impose restriction or trade commerce. Article 307 appointment of authority for carrying out the purpose of Article 301 to 304. Part 14 service under the union and the state. Article 308 interpretation. Article 309 recruitment and condition of a service of person serving the union or a state. Section 310 tenure of office person serving the union or a state. Section 311 dismissal, removal or reduction in rank of person employed in civil capacity under the union or state. Article 312 All India Service. Article 312A power of parliament to vary or revoke condition of service of officer of certain services. Article 313 transitional provision. Article 340 provision for protection of existing officer of certain services. Article 315 public service commission for the union and for the state. Article 316 appointment and term of office of member. Article 317 removal and suspension of a member of Public Service Commission. Article 318 power to make regulation as to condition of service of member and staff of the commission. Article 319 provision as to the holding of offices by member of commission on ceasing to be such member. Article 320 function of Public Service Commission. Article 321 power to extend function of Public Service Commission. Article 322 expenses of Public Service Commission. Article 323 report of Public Service Commission. Article 48 tribunals. 323A administrative tribunal. 323B tribunal for other matter. Part 15 election. Article 324 superintendence election and control of election to be vested in election commission. Article 325 no person to be eligible for inclusion in or to claim to be included in special electoral roll on ground of religion, race, caste or sex. Article 326 election to the House of the People and to the Legislative Assembly of State to be on the basis of adult suffrage. Article 327 power of Parliament to make provision with respect to election to legislature. Article 328 power of legislature of a state to make provision with respect to election to such legislature. Article 329 bar to interference by court in electoral matter. Article 329 special provision as to election to Parliament in the cases of Prime Minister and Speaker. Part 16 special provision relating to certain clause. Article 330 reservation of seat for scheduled caste and scheduled tribe in the House of People. Article 331 representation of Anglo-Indian community of the House of People. Article 332 reservation of seat for scheduled caste and scheduled tribe in the Legislative Assembly of the state. Article 333 representation of Anglo-Indian community in the Legislative Assembly of the state. Article 334 reservation of seat and special reservation to siege after 60 years. Article 335 claim of scheduled caste and scheduled tribe to service and post. Article 330 special provision for Anglo-Indian community in certain provision service. Article 337 special provision with respect to educational grant for the benefit of Anglo-Indian community. Article 338 National Commission for Scheduled Caste. Article 338A National Commission for Scheduled Tribe. Article 339 Control of the Union over the administration of scheduled area and the welfare of scheduled tribe. Article 340 Appointment of a commission to investigate the condition of backward classes. Article 341 Scheduled Caste. Article 342 Scheduled Tribe. Article 342A Socially and Educationally Backward Classes. Part 17 Official Language. 343 Official Language of the Union. 344 Composition and Committee of Parliament on Official Language. 343 Official Language for Communication between one state and another or between a state and the Union. 347 Special Provision relating to language spoken by a section of the population of a state. 348 Language to be used in the Supreme Court and in the High Court and for Act, Bill, etc. 349 Special procedure for enactment of law, certain law relating to language. 350 Language to be used in representative for redress of grievance. 350 Facility for instruction in matter tongue at primary stage. 350 Special Officer for Linguistic Minorities. 351 Directive for Development of Hindi Language. Part 18 Emergency Provision. 352 Proclamation of Emergency. 353 Effect of Proclamation of Emergency. 354 Application of Provision relating to distribution of revenue while a proclamation of emergency is in operation. 355 Duty of the Union to protect state against external aggression and internal distribution. 356 Provision in case of failure of constitutional machinery in state. 357 Exercise of legislative power under proclamation issued under Article 356. 358 Suspension of provision of Article 90 during emergency. 359 Suspension of the enforcement of the right conferred Part 3 during emergency. 359 Application of this part to the state of Punjab. 360 Provision as to financial emergency. Part 19 Miscellaneous. Article 361 Protection of President and Governor and Raj Pramukh. 361 Protection of Publication of Proceeding for Parliament and its Legislature. 361B Disqualification for the appointment on remunerative political post. 362 Right and Privilege of Ruler of Indian State. 363 Bar to interference by court in dispute arising out of certain territories and agreement etc. 363 A recognition granted to ruler of Indian state to seize and privy purse to be abolished. 364 Special provision as to major port and aerodrome. 366 Effect of failure to comply with or to give effect to direction given by the Union. 366 Definition. 367 Interpretation. Part 20 Amendment of Constitution. 368 Power of Parliament to amend the Constitution and procedure thereof. Part 21 Temporary, Transitional and Special Provision. 369 Temporary Power of Parliament to make law with respect to certain matter in the state lists as if they were matter in the concrete list. 370 Temporary provision with respect to the state of Jammu and Kashmir. 370 Special provision with respect to state of Maharashtra and Gujarat. 378 Special provision with respect to Nagaland. 370 Special provision with respect to Assam. 371C Special provision with respect to state of Manipur. 377D Andhra Pradesh. 371 Andhra Pradesh. 370F Sikkim. 371 G Mizoram. H Andhra Pradesh. H Goa. 373 Power of President to make. 372 Continuation in force of existing law and then adoption. 372 Power of President to adopt law. 373 Power of President to make order in respect person under preventive detention in certain cases. 374 Provision as to judge and federal and proceeding pending in the federal court or before his magistrating council. 375 Court authorities on 56th officer to court function to the provision of the Constitution. 376 Provision as to Judge of High Court. 377 Provision as to Comptroller and Auditor General of India. 378 Provision as to Public Commission. 378 A Special Provision as to Direction of Andhra Pradesh. 392 Power of the President to remove difficulties. Part 22 Article 393 short title. Article 394 Commencement. Article 394 authority text in any line. Enter 395 refill.